friends. Thank you for joining me for this Sunday's Once Upon a Storybook as we continue reading Anne of Avonlea. Today we are going to be reading chapters 14, A Danger Averted, and chapter 15, The Beginning of Vacation. Starting with chapter 14, A Danger Averted. Anne, walking home from the post office one Friday evening, was joined by Miss Lynn, who was, as usual, cumbered with all the cares of church and state. "I've just been down to Timothy Cotton's to see if I could get Alice Louise to help me for a few days," she said. "I had her last week, for, though she's too slow to stop quick, she's better than nobody. But she's sick and can't come. Timothy's sitting there, too, coughing and complaining. He's been dying for 10 years, and he'll go on dying for 10 years more. That kind can't even die and have done with it. They can't stick to anything, even to being sick, long enough to finish it. They're a terrible shiftless family, and by the way, that was shiftless. They're a terrible shiftless family, and what is to become of them, I don't know, but perhaps Providence does." Mrs. Lynn sighed as if she'd rather doubted the extent of provincial knowledge on the subject. "Marilla was in about her eyes again Tuesday, wasn't she? What did the specialist think of them?" she continued. "He was much pleased," said Anne brightly. "He says there's a great improvement in them, and he thinks the danger of her losing her sight completely is past. But he says she'll never be able to read much or do any fine handwork again. How are your preparations for your bazaar coming on?" The Ladies' Aid Society was preparing for a fair and a supper, and Miss Lynn was the head in front of the enterprise. "Pretty well," says Miss Lynn, "and that reminds me, Miss Allen thinks it'd be nice to fix up a booth like an old-time kitchen and serve a supper of baked beans, doughnuts, pie, and so on. We're collecting old-fashioned fixings everywhere. Miss Simon Fletcher is going to lend us her mother's braided rugs, and Miss Levi Bolter some old chairs, and Aunt Mary Shaw will lend us her cupboard with the glass doors. I suppose Marilla will let us have her brass candlesticks. And we want all the old dishes we can get. Miss Allen is especially set on having a real blue willow-ware platter if we can find one. But nobody seems to have one. Do you know where we could get one?" "Miss Josephine Barry has one. I'll write and ask her. She'll lend it for the occasion," said Anne. "Well, I wish you would. I guess we'll have the supper in about a fortnight's time. Uncle Abe Andrews is prophesying rain and storms for about that time, and that's a pretty sure sign we'll have fine weather." The said Uncle Abe, it may be mentioned, was at least like other prophets in that he had a small honor in his own country. He was in fact considered in the light of a standing joke, for few of his weather predictions were ever fulfilled. Mr. Elijah Wright, who labored under the impression that he was a local wit, used to say that nobody in Avonlea ever thought of looking in the Charlottetown dailies for weather probabilities. No, they just asked Uncle Abe what it was going to be tomorrow and expected the opposite. Nothing daunted, Uncle Abe kept on prophesying. "We want to have the fair over before the election comes off," continued Miss Lynn, "for the candidates will be sure to come and spend lots of money. The Tories are bribing right and left, so they might as well be given a chance to spend their money honestly for once." Anne was a red-hot conservative out of loyalty to Matthew's memory, but she said nothing. She knew better than to get Miss Lynn started on politics. She had a letter from Marilla postmarked from a town in British Columbia. "It's probably from the children's uncle," she said excitedly when she got home. "Oh, Marilla, I wonder what he's going to say about them." The best plan might be to open it and see," said Marilla curtly. A close observer might have thought that she was excited also, but she would have rather died than show it. Anne tore open the letter and glanced over the somewhat untidy and poorly written contents. "He says he can't take the children this spring. He's been sick most of the winter, and his wedding is put off. He wants to know if we can keep them till the fall, and he'll try and take them then. We will, of course, won't we, Marilla?" "I don't see that there's anything else for us to do," said Marilla rather grimly, although she felt a secret relief. "Anyhow, they're not so much trouble as they were, or else we've got used to them. Davy has improved a great deal." His manners are certainly much better, said Anne cautiously, as if she were not prepared to say as much for his morals. Anne had come home from school the previous evening to find Marilla away at an aid meeting, Dora asleep on the kitchen sofa, and Davy in the sitting room closet, blissfully absorbing the contents of a jar of Marilla's famous yellow plum preserves. Company jam, Davy called it, which he had been forbidden to touch. He looked very guilty when Anne pounced on him and whisked him out of the closet. Davy Keith, don't you know that this is very wrong of you to be eating that jam, when you were told never to meddle with anything in that closet? Yes, I knew it was wrong, admitted Davy uncomfortably, but plum jam is awful nice, Anne. I just peeped in and it looked so good I thought I'd take just a weeny taste. I stuck my finger in, Anne groaned, and licked it clean, and it was so much gooder than I ever thought. I got a spoon and just sailed in. Anne gave such a serious lecture on the sin of stealing plum jam that Davy became conscience-stricken and promised with repentant kisses never to do it again. Anyhow, there'll be plenty of jam in heaven, that's one comfort, he said complacently. Anne nipped a smile in the bud. Perhaps there will, if we want it, she said. But what makes you think so? Why, it's the catechism, said Davy. Oh, there is nothing like that in the catechism, Davy. But I tell you there is, persisted Davy. It was in that question Marilla taught me last Sunday. Why should we love God? It says because he makes preserves and redeems us. Perseveres is just a holy way of saying jam. Oh, preserves, he said. Preserves is just a holy way of saying jam. I might get a drink of water, said Anne hastily. When she came back, it cost her some time and trouble to explain to Davy that a certain comma in the said catechism question made a great deal of difference in the meaning. Well, I thought it was too good to be true, he said at last with a sigh of disappointed conviction. And besides, I didn't see when he'd find time to make jam, and if it's one endless Sabbath day, as the hymn says, I don't believe I want to go to heaven. Won't there ever be any Saturdays in heaven, Anne? Yes, Saturdays and every other kind of beautiful days, and every day in heaven will be more beautiful than the one before it, Davy, assured Anne, who was rather glad that Marilla was not by to be shocked. Marilla, it is needless to say, was bringing the twins up in the good old ways of theology and discouraged all fanciful speculations thereupon. Davy and Dora were taught a hymn, a catechism question, and 2 Bible verses every Sunday. Dora learned meekly and recited like a little machine, with perhaps as much understanding or interest as if she were one. Davy, on the contrary, had a lively curiosity and frequently asked questions which made Marilla tremble for his fate. Chester Sloane says we'll do nothing all the time in heaven but walk around in white dresses and play on harps. And he says he hopes he won't have to go till he's an old man, 'cause maybe he'll like it better then. And he thinks it will be horrid to wear dresses, and I think so too. Why can't men angels wear trousers, Anne? Chester Sloane is interested in those things because they're going to make a minister of him. He's got to be a minister because his grandmother left the money to send him to college, and he can't have it unless he is a minister. She thought a minister was such a respectable thing to have in the family. Chester says he doesn't mind much, though he'd rather be a blacksmith, but he's bound to have all the fun he can before he begins to be a minister, because he doesn't expect to have much afterwards. I ain't going to be a minister. I'm going to be a storekeeper, like Mr. Blair, and keep heaps of candies and bananas. But I'd rather like going to your kind of heaven if they'd let me play a mouth organ instead of a harp. Do you suppose they would? Yeah, I think they would if you wanted it, was all Anne could trust herself to say. The AVIS met at Mr. Harmon Andrews that evening, and a full attendance had been requested, since important business was to be discussed. The AVIS was in a flourishing condition and had already accomplished wonders. Early in the spring, Mr. Major Spencer had redeemed his promise and had stumped, graded, and seeded down all the row front of his farm. A dozen other men, some prompted by a determination not to let Spencer get ahead of them, others goaded into action by improvers in their own households, had followed his example. The result was that there were long strips of smooth velvet turf where once there had been unsightly undergrowth or brush. The farm fronts that had not been done looked so badly by contrast that their owners were secretly shamed into resolving to see what they could do another spring. The triangle of ground at the crossroads had also been cleared and seeded down, and Anne's bed of geraniums, unharmed by any marauding cow, was already set out in the center. Altogether, the improvers thought that they were getting on beautifully, even if Mr. Levi Bolter, tactfully approached by a carefully selected committee in regard to the old house on his upper farm, did bluntly tell them that he wasn't going to have it meddled with. At this special meeting, they intended to draw a petition to the school trustees, humbly praying that a fence be put around the school grounds, and a plan was also to be discussed for planting a few ornamental trees by the church, if the funds of the society would permit of it. For as Anne said, there was no use in starting another subscription as long as the hall remained blue. The members were assembled in the Andrews parlor, and Jane was already on her feet to move the appointment of a committee which should find out and report on the price of said trees, when Gertie Pye swept in. Pompadoured and frilled within an inch of her life, Gertie had a habit of being late, to make her entrance more effective, spiteful people said. Gertie's entrance in this instance was certainly effective, for she paused dramatically on the middle of the floor, threw up her hands, rolled her eyes, and exclaimed, "I've just heard something perfectly awful. What do you think? Mr. Judson Parker is going to rent all the road fence of his farm to a patent medicine company to paint advertisements on it." For once in her life, Gertie Pye made all the sensation she desired. If she'd have thrown a bomb among the complacent improvers, she could hardly have made more. "It can't be true," said Anne blankly. "That's just what I said when I heard it first, don't you know," said Gertie, who was enjoying herself hugely. "I said it couldn't be true, that Judson Parker wouldn't have the heart to do it, don't you know? But Father met him this afternoon and asked him about it, and he said it was true. Just fancy. His farm is side on to the Newbridge Road, and how perfectly awful it will look to see advertisements of pills and plasters all along it. Don't you know?" The improvers did know, all too well. Even the least imaginative among them could picture the grotesque effect of half a mile of board fence adorned with such advertisements. All thought of church and school grounds vanished before this new danger. Parliamentary rules and regulations were forgotten, and Anne, in despair, gave up trying to keep minutes at all. Everybody talked at once, and fearful was the hubbub. "Oh, let us keep calm," implored Anne, who was the most excited of them all, "and try to think of some way of preventing him." "I don't know how you're going to prevent him," exclaimed Jane bitterly. "Everybody knows what Judson Parker is. He'll do anything for money. He hasn't a spark of public spirit or any sense of the beautiful." The prospect looked rather unpromising. Judson Parker and his sister were the only Parkers in Avonlea, so that no leverage could be exerted by family connections. Martha Parker was a lady of all too certain age who disapproved of young people in general, and the improvers in particular. Judson was a jovial, smooth-spoken man, so uniformly good-natured and bland that it was surprising how few friends he had. Perhaps he had got the better in too many business transactions, which seldom makes for popularity. He was reputed to be very sharp, and it was the general opinion that he hadn't much principle. "If Judson Parker has a chance to turn an honest penny, as he says himself, he'll never lose it," declared Fred Wright. "Is there nobody who has influence over him?" asked Anne despairingly. "He goes to see Louisa Spencer at White Sands," suggested Carrie Sloane. "Perhaps she could coax him not to rent his fences." "Not she," said Gilbert emphatically. "I know Louisa Spencer well. She doesn't believe in village improvement societies, but she does believe in dollars and cents. She'd be more likely to urge Judson on than to dissuade him." "The only thing to do is appoint a committee to wait on him and protest," said Julia Bell. "And you must send girls, for he'll hardly be civil to the boys." "But I won't go, so nobody need nominate me." "Better send Anne alone," said Oliver Sloane. "She can talk Judson over if anybody can." Anne protested. She was willing to go and do the talking, but she must have others with her for moral support. Diana and Jane were therefore appointed to support her morally, and the improvers broke up, buzzing like angry bees with indignation. Anne was so worried that she didn't sleep until nearly morning, and then she dreamed that the trustees had put a fence around the school and painted tri-purple pills all over it. The committee waited on Judson Parker the next afternoon. Anne pleaded eloquently against his nefarious design, and Jane and Diana supported her morally and valiantly. Judson was sleek, suave, flattering, paid them several compliments of the delicacy of sunflowers, felt real bad to refuse such charming young ladies, but business was business. Couldn't afford to let sentiment stand in the way these hard times. "But I tell you what I will do," he said, with a twinkle in his lightful eyes. "I'll tell the agent he must use only handsome, tasty colors, red and yellow and so on. I'll tell him he mustn't paint the ads blue on any account." The vanquished committee retired, thinking things not lawful to be uttered. "We have done all we can do and must simply trust the rest to Providence," said Jane, with an unconscious imitation of Mrs. Lynde's tone and manner. "I wonder if Mr. Allen could do anything," reflected Diana. Anne shook her head. "No, it's no use to worry Mr. Allen, especially now when the baby's so sick. Judson would slip away from him as smoothly as from us, although he has taken to going to church quite regularly just now. That is simply because Louisa Spencer, father is an elder and very particular about such things." "Judson Parker is the only man in Avonlea who would dream of renting his fences," said Jane indignantly. "Even Levi Bolter or Lorenzo White would never stoop to that, tight-fisted as they are. They would have too much respect for public opinion." Public opinion was certainly down on Judson Parker when the facts became known, but that did not help matters much. Judson chuckled to himself and defied it, and the improvers were trying to reconcile themselves to the prospect of seeing the prettiest part of the New Bridge Road defaced by advertisements, when Anne rose quietly at the president's call for reports of committees on the occasion of the next meeting of the society, and announced that Mr. Judson Parker had instructed her to inform the society that he was not going to rent his fences to the Patent Medicine Company. Jane and Diana stared as if they found it hard to believe their ears. Parliamentary etiquette, which was generally very strictly enforced, and the AVIS forbade them giving instant vent to their curiosity. But after the society adjourned, Anne was besieged for explanations. Anne had no explanation to give. Judson Parker had overtaken her on the road the preceding evening and told her that he decided to humor the AVIS in its peculiar prejudice against patent medicine advertisements. That was all Anne would say, then or ever afterwards, and it was the simple truth. But when Jane Andrews on her way home confided to Oliver Sloane her firm belief that there was more behind Judson Parker's mysterious change of heart than Anne Shirley had revealed, she spoke the truth also. Anne had been down to old Miss Irving's on the shore road the preceding evening and had come home by a short cut which led first over the low-lying shore fields and then through the beech wood below Robert Dixon's by a little footpath that ran out to the main road just above the lake of shining waters, known to unimaginative people as Barry's Pond. Two men were sitting in their buggies, reined off to the side of the road just at the entrance of the path. One was Judson Parker, and the other was Jerry Corcoran, a Newbridge man against whom, as Miss Lynde would have told you in eloquent italics, nothing shady has ever been proved. He was an agent for agricultural implements and a prominent personage in matters political. He had a finger, some people said all his fingers, in every political pie that was cooked, and as Canada was on the eye of a general election, Jerry Corcoran had been a busy man for many weeks, canvassing the country in the interest of his party's candidate. Just as Anne emerged from under the overhanging beech boughs, she heard Corcoran say, "If you'll vote for Amesbury, Parker, well, I've a note for that pair of harrowers you've got in the spring. I suppose you wouldn't object to having it back, eh?" "Well, since you put it that way," drawled Judson with a grin, "I reckon I might as well do it." A man must look out for his own interest in these hard times. Both saw Anne at this moment, and conversation abruptly ceased. Anne bowed frostily and walked on with her chin slightly more tilted than usual. Soon Judson Parker overtook her. "Have a lift, Anne?" he inquired gently. "Thank you, no," said Anne politely, but with a fine needle-like disdain in her voice that pierced even Judson Parker's none too sensitive consciousness. His face reddened and he twitched his reins angrily. But the next second, prudential considerations checked him. He looked uneasily at Anne as she walked steadily on, glancing neither to the right nor to the left. Had she heard Concorin's unmistakable offer and his own to plain acceptance of it? Confound Corcoran! If he couldn't put his meaning into less dangerous phrases, he'd get into trouble some of these long come shorts. And confound red-headed schoolma'ams with a habit of popping out of beechwoods where they had no business to be. If Anne had heard Judson Parker measuring her corn in his own half bushel, as the country saying went, and cheating himself thereby, as such people generally do, believed that she would tell it far and wide. Now Judson Parker has been seen, but not overly regretful of public opinion, but to be known as having accepted a bribe would be a nasty thing. And if it ever reached Isaac Spencer's ear, If it ever reached Isaac Spencer's ears, farewell forever to all hope of winning Louisa Jane, with her comfortable prospects as the heiress of a well-to-do farmer. Judson Parker knew that Mr. Spencer looked somewhat askance at him as it was. He could not afford to take any risk. "Anne, I've been wanting to see you about that little matter we were discussing the other day. I've decided not to let my fences to that company after all. A society with an aim like yours ought to be encouraged." Anne thawed at the merest trifle. "Thank you," she said. And you needn't mention that little conversation of mine with Jerry." "I have no intention of mentioning it in any case," said Anne icily, for she would have seen every fence in Avonlea painted with advertisements before she would have stooped to bargain with a man who would sell his vote. Just so, agreed Judson, imagining that they understood each other beautifully. "I didn't suppose you would. Of course, I was only stringing Jerry. He thinks he's so all-fired cute and smart. I've no intention of voting for Amesbury. I'm going to vote for Grant, as I've always done, and you'll see that when the election comes off. I just led Jerry on to see if he would commit himself. And it's all right about the fence. You can tell the improvers that. It takes all sorts of people to make a world, as I've often heard, but I think there's some who could be spared." Anne told her reflection in the East Gable mirror that night. "I wouldn't have mentioned the disgraceful thing to a soul anyhow, so my conscience is clear on that score. I really don't know who or what is to be thanked for this. I did nothing to bring it about, and it's hard to believe that Providence ever works by means of the kind of politics men like Judson Parker and Jerry Corcoran have." Chapter 15. The Beginning of Vacation. Anne locked the schoolhouse door on a still yellow evening when the winds were purring in the spruces around the playground, and the shadows were long and lazy by the edge of the woods. She dropped the key into her pocket with a sigh of satisfaction. The school year was ended, and she had been re-engaged for the next, with many expressions of satisfaction. Only Mr. Harmon Andrews told her she ought to use the strap oftener, and two delightful months of a well-earned vacation beckoned her invitingly. Anne felt at peace with the world and herself as she walked down the hill with her basket of flowers in her hand. Since the earliest Mayflowers, Anne had never missed her weekly pilgrimage to Matthew's grave. Everybody else in Avonlea except Marilla had already forgotten quiet, shy, unimportant Matthew Cuthbert. But his memory was still green in Anne's heart and always would be. She would never forget the kind old man who had been the first to give her the love and sympathy her starved childhood had craved. At the foot of the hill, a boy was sitting on the fence in the shadow of the spruces. A boy with big, dreamy eyes and a beautiful, sensitive face. He swung down and joined Anne, smiling, but there were traces of tears on his cheek. "I thought I'd wait for you, teacher, because I knew you were going to the graveyard," he said. slipping his hand into hers. I'm going there too. I'm taking this bouquet of geraniums to put on Grandpa Irving's grave for Grandma. And look, teacher, I'm going to put this bunch of white roses beside Grandpa's grave in memory of my little mother, because I can't go to her grave to put it there. But don't you think she'll know all about it just the same? Yes, I'm sure she will, Paul. You see, teacher, it's just 3 years today since my little mother died. It's such a long, long time, but it hurts just as much as ever. And I miss her just as much as ever. Sometimes it seems to me that I just can't bear it. It hurts so. Paul's voice quivered and his lip trembled. He looked down at his roses, hoping that his teacher would not notice the tears in his eyes. And yet, said Anne very softly, you wouldn't want it to stop hurting. You wouldn't want to forget your little mother even if you could. No, indeed I wouldn't. That's just the way I feel. You're so good at understanding, teacher. Nobody else understands so well, not even Grandma, although she's so good to me. Father understood pretty well, but still I couldn't talk much to him about Mother because it made him feel so bad. When he put his hand over his face, I always knew it was time to stop. Poor Father, he must be dreadfully lonesome without me. But you see, he has nobody but a housekeeper now, and he thinks housekeepers are no good to bring up little boys, especially when he has to be away from home so much on business. Grandmothers are better, next to mothers. Someday when I'm brought up, I'll go back to Father, and we're never going to be parted again. Paul had talked so much to Anne about his mother and father that she felt as if she had known them. She thought his mother must have been a very like what he was himself in temperament and disposition, and she had an idea that Stephen Irving was a rather reserved man with a deep and tender nature which he kept hidden scrupulously from the world. Father's not very easy to get acquainted with, Paul had once said. I never got really acquainted with him until after my little mother died, but he's splendid when you get to know him. I love him the best in all the world, and Grandma Irving next, and then you, teacher. I love you next to Father if it wasn't my duty to love Grandma Irving best, because she's doing so much for me. You know, teacher, I wish she would leave the lamp in my room till I go to sleep, though. She takes it right out as soon as she tucks me up because she says I mustn't be a coward. I'm not scared, but I'd rather have the light. My little mother used to always sit beside me and hold my hand till I went to sleep. I expect she spoiled me. Mothers do sometimes, you know. No, Anne did not know this, although she might imagine it. She thought sadly of her little mother, the mother who had thought her so perfectly beautiful and who had died so long ago and was buried beside her boyish husband in that unvisited grave far away. Anne could not remember her mother, and for this reason she almost envied Paul. My birthday is next week, said Paul as they walked up the long red hill, basking in the June sunshine, and Father wrote me that he is sending me something that he thinks I'll like better than anything else he could send. I believe it has come already, for Grandma is keeping the bookcase drawer locked, and this is something new. And when I asked her why, she just looked mysterious and said little boys mustn't be too curious. It's very exciting to have a birthday, isn't it? I'll be 11. You never think it to look at me, would you? Grandma says I'm very small for my age, and that is all because I don't eat enough porridge. I do my very best, but Grandma gives such generous platefuls. There's nothing mean about Grandma, I can tell you. Ever since you and I had that talk about praying, going home from Sunday school that day, teacher, when you said we ought to pray about all our difficulties, I've prayed every night that God would give me enough grace to enable me to eat every bit of my porridge in the mornings. But I've never been able to do it yet, and whether it's because I have too little grace or too much porridge, I really can't decide. Grandma says Father was brought up on porridge, and it certainly did work well in his case, for you ought to see his shoulders. He has. But sometimes, concluded Paul with a sigh and a meditative air, I really think porridge will be the death of me. Anne permitted herself a smile since Paul was not looking at her. All Avonlea knew that old Miss Irving was bringing her grandson up in accordance with the good old-fashioned methods of diet and morals. Let us hope not, dear, she said cheerfully. How are your rock people coming on? Does the oldest twin still continue to behave himself? He has to, said Paul emphatically. He knows I won't associate with him if he doesn't. He is really full of wickedness, I think. And has Nora found out that about the golden lady yet? No, but I think she suspects. I'm almost sure she watched me the last time I went to the cave. I don't mind if she finds out. It is only for her sake I don't want her to, so that her feelings won't be hurt. But if she is determined to have her feelings hurt, it can't be helped. If I were to go to the store some night with you, do you think I could see your rock people too? Paul shook his head gravely. No, I don't think you could see my rock people. I'm the only person who can see them. But you could see rock people of your own. You're one of the kind that can. We're both that kind, you know, teacher, he added, squeezing her hand chummily. Isn't it splendid to be that kind, teacher? Splendid, Anne agreed, gray shining eyes looking down into blue shining ones. Anne and Paul both knew. How fair the realm imagination opens to the view. And both knew the way to that happy land. There the rose of joy bloomed immortal by dale and stream. Clouds never darkened the sunny sky. Sweet bells never jangled out of tune, and kindred spirits abounded. The knowledge of that land's geography, east o' the sun, west o' the moon, is priceless lore, not to be bought in any marketplace. It must be the gift of the good fairies at birth, and the years can never deface it or take it away. It's better to possess it, living in the garret, than to be inhabitant of palaces without it. The Avonlea graveyard was as yet the grass-grown solitude it had always been. To be sure, the improvers had an eye on it, and Priscilla Grant had read a paper on cemeteries before the last meeting of the society. At some future time, the improvers meant to have the lichen wayward old board fence replaced by a neat wire railing, the grass mown, and the leaning monument straightened up. Anne put on Matthew's grave the flowers she had brought for it, and then went over to the little popular shaded corner where Hester Gray slept. Ever since the day of spring picnic, Anne put flowers on Hester's grave when she visited Matthew's. The evening before, she had made a pilgrimage back to the little deserted garden in the woods and brought therefore some of Hester's own white roses. I thought you would like them better than any others, dear, she said softly. Anne was still sitting there when a shadow fell over the grass, and she looked up to see Mrs. Allen. They walked home together. Mrs. Allen's face was not the face of the girl bride whom the minister had brought to Avonlea 5 years before. It had lost some of its bloom and youthful curves, and there were fine, patient lines about her eyes and her mouth. A tiny grave in that very cemetery accounted for some of them, and some new ones had come during the recent illness, now happily over, of her little son. But Miss Allen's dimples were as sweet and sudden as ever, her eyes as clear and bright and true, and what her face lacked of girlish beauty was now more than atoned for in added tenderness and strength. I suppose you're looking to your vacation, Anne, she said as they left the graveyard. Anne nodded. Yes, I could roll the word as a sweet morsel under my tongue. I think the summer is going to be lovely. For one thing, Mrs. Morgan is coming to the island in July, and Priscilla is going to bring her up. I feel one of my old thrills at the mere thought. I hope you'll have a good time, Anne. You've worked very hard this past year, and you have succeeded. Oh, I don't know. I've come so far short in so many things. I haven't done what I meant to do when I began to teach last fall. I haven't lived up to my ideals. None of us ever do, said Miss Allen with a sigh. But then, Anne, you know what Lowell says. Not failing, but low aim is crime. We must have ideals and try to live up to them, even if we never quite succeed. Life would be a sorry business without them. With them, it's grand and great. Hold fast to your ideals, Anne. I shall try, but I've let go of most of my theories, said Anne, laughing a little. I had the most beautiful set of theories you ever know when I started out as a schoolma'am, but every one of them has failed me at some pinch or another. Even the theory on corporal punishment, teased Mrs. Allen. But Anne flushed. I shall never forgive myself for whipping Anthony. Nonsense, dear. He deserved it, and it agreed with him. You've had no trouble with him since, and he has come to think there's nobody like you. Your kindness won his love after the idea that a girl was no good was rooted out of his stubborn mind. He may have deserved it, but that is not the point. If I had calmly and deliberately decided to whip him because I thought it a just punishment for him, I would not feel over it as I do. But the truth is, Miss Allen, that I just flew into a temper and whipped him because of that. I wasn't thinking whether it was just or unjust. Even if he hadn't deserved it, I'd have done it just the same. That's what humiliates me. Well, we all make mistakes, dear, so just put it behind you. We should regret our mistakes and learn from them, but never carry them forward into the future with us. There goes Gilbert Blythe on the wheel. Home for his vacation too, I suppose. How are you and he getting on with your studies? Pretty well. We plan to finish the Virgil tonight. There are only 20 lines to do. Then we're not going to study any more until September. Do you think you'll ever get to college? Oh, I don't know. Anne looked dreamily afar to the opal-tinted horizon. Marilla's eyes will not be much better than they are now, although we are so thankful to think that they will not get worse. And then there are the twins. Somehow, I don't believe their uncle will ever really send for them. Perhaps college may be around the bend in the road, but I've not got to the bend yet, and I don't think much about it unless I might grow discontented. Well, I should like to see you go to college, Anne, but if you never do, don't be discontented about it. We make our own lives wherever we are. After all, college can only help us do it more easily. They are broad or narrow according to what we put into them, not what we get out. Life is rich and full here, everywhere, if we can only learn how to open our whole hearts to its richness and its fullness. I think I understand what you mean, said Anne thoughtfully, and I know I have so much to feel thankful for. Oh, so much. My work and Paul Irving and the dear twins and all my friends. Do you know, Miss Allen, I'm so thankful for friendship. It beautifies life so much. True friendship is a very helpful thing indeed, said Miss Allen, and we should have a very high ideal of it and never sully it by any failure in truth and sincerity. I fear the name of friendship is often degraded to a kind of intimacy that has nothing of real friendship in it. Yes, like Gertie Pye and Julia Bell's. They're very intimate and go everywhere together, but Gertie is always saying nasty things of Julia behind her back, and everybody thinks she's jealous of her because she's always so pleased when anybody criticizes Julia. I think it is desecration to call that friendship. If we have friends, we should look out for the best in them and give them the best that is in us, don't you think? Then friendship would be the most beautiful thing in the world. Friendship is very beautiful, smiled Miss Allen, but someday... Then she paused abruptly. In the delicate, white-browed face beside her, with its candid eyes and mobile features, there was still far more of the child than of the woman. Anne's heart so far harbored only dreams of friendship and ambition, and Miss Allen did not wish to brush the bloom from her sweet unconsciousness. So she left her sentence for the future years to finish. Well, thank you for joining me for this storybook adventure. I hope you enjoyed these 2 chapters. I know I did. I continue to enjoy this journey that we are on with Anne of Green Gables. And until next time, be joyful, my friends. Stay crafty in your own way. Make your own joyful creations. And above everything else, my friends, please not only remember, but never forget, you are made of matter. Therefore, you matter. So be your own exclamation. All right. See you next week. Nugs and JOY, everyone.